Welcome to another edition of Real Estate Realities with the Rebel Broker. My name is Robert Whitelaw, and I am the Rebel Broker, licensed real estate broker right here in Silicon Valley, California, serving the Bay Area since 1988. And this week, we have got an amazing show for you. So for those of you who've been longtime listeners to the show, whether you've been on the podcast or listening to the podcast since 2007 or listening to the other videos that I do, I frequently cover stuff that the Pacific Legal Foundation is up to. I think they're a fantastic organization, and I think they're one of the few organizations that are out there fighting for you and your property rights every single day. And they get up in front of the Supreme Court on a regular basis. And this year they have had an amazing success track record. And I am lucky enough to have the privilege of interviewing Christina Martin from the Pacific Legal Foundation. And I wanted to use it as an opportunity to discuss some of her amazing victories this year, particularly the one that we've actually done shows on relating to equity theft. I think I did a whole podcast. I think I did a video. I did a couple of different things on equity theft and what a crazy thing it is. And when you get into the details, it's amazing that it has survived as long as it has. But you don't need to listen to me. Let's go ahead and jump right in to this week's interview with Christina Martin from the Pacific Legal Foundation. Let's sit back and take a listen. I hope you enjoy it. So, yeah, I'm, and I was just kind of doing a little bit of a review because I realized that, you guys have actually had some pretty amazing successes for the whole term, for this term of the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Now, what I'd like to do first really is sort of get into what brought you to Pacific Legal Foundation, and maybe even what's kept you there, because I know it's got to be an uphill slog against the Goliath of government institutions.
Sure. Yeah. That's always a fun thing to talk about.
Yeah. So what got you, how did you end up at Pacific Legal Foundation?
So I graduated law school in the middle of the 2008 financial crisis, the housing crunch.
Mm-hmm.
And I applied for a bunch of legal jobs. I would call these entry-level jobs and they would say, "Oh, we got hundreds of applications for that position." And I'm going, "This is crazy."
Yeah.
So I decided I'd think outside of the box a little bit. And I applied at a think tank, a public policy think tank in Portland, Oregon, where I was living, and got hired and advocated essentially policies that limit government, that improve individual choice, things like school choice, where families would be able to pick where to send their kid to school.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and not just be tied to the local government school. So that was a fun experience, and that's actually where I learned about Pacific Legal Foundation. I met a PLF client who had been the subject of a sting operation in Portland.
Wow.
Yeah. So he had he was paying his taxes. He had his business license. He had, you know, everything that you would normally need, except he didn't have one thing, and that was called a certificate of need. And in order to operate a moving business in Oregon at the time, you needed this certificate of need, which essentially operated as a competitor's veto. So you would have to show an economic need for a moving business, and
Oh,
the
yeah. Okay.
competing companies would go, "There is no need," and so it would, your application would be vetoed. So he didn't have that, and PLF filed a lawsuit on his behalf, and I'd never seen the Oregon legislature move so fast. They very quickly fixed the law,
Yeah.
and so that to me was pretty remarkable, for them to get the Oregon legislature to move so quickly to do the right thing. And it saved this guy's business. So it was a really big deal, and he was very emotional about it. Grateful to PLF. And so anyway, I became a big fan of PLF, and then eventually decided to apply and start practicing law, and that's where I am still.
Well, and you kind of hit on something there that I think is interesting, right? And you will always see whatever rights you give or whatever things the government starts to do. I always like to think there was a kernel of a good idea in here somewhere, and you have to bet on every single person in government that follows you being of the same saintly state as the person who came up with the idea, right? Because I have yet to see anything like this that we create for the government to have more control, not ultimately get abused. And maybe for the more cynical among us, it was created to be abused, right? It was created to create an environment where the players in the game get to decide who does not get to play. And obviously they don't want more to play because they don't want the competition, right? So, and maybe someday over an adult beverage, we can have a conversation about how, the United States went from having something like 60 car manufacturers to having four, because of, regulations that made it impossible for the little guys to compete with the folks who could pay all the accountants and all the other folks that needed to be part of the law. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Now you're treading into the regulatory capture world.
yeah.
So
Yeah, and in this, the great thing is we're going to talk specifically about equity theft on this one because that's just a super amazing victory, and it is so clearly something that's wrong, yet has gone on for so long and still goes on in some areas. They have yet to catch up with the new change in the law. But there's also on the virtually the same day you had a victory against the EPA. So
yeah.
we can talk about that too if you've got time. But first, what I'd love to do is get some background on Tyler v. Hennepin. I know that's the one. I'm not going to assume anybody else knows any more about it other than I just said those words. So,
Yeah.
what can you tell us about the ground assumptions that were made here, why they were wrong, how you approached it, and just let us know how it all unfolded?
Sure. So Geraldine Tyler is our client in that case. She's now 94 years old. And what happened was she had lived in a condo for more than a decade. For health and safety reasons, decided to move into a senior community and then stopped paying her property taxes. And so she owed about $2,300 in property taxes plus almost $13,000 in penalties, interest, and collection costs, administrative costs, all kinds of.
13,000
Yeah.
in penalties.
And interest and collection costs and whatever else the government's put in there. And
A lot of
so,
money.
yeah, to collect that debt, Hennepin County seized her condo. And you would think they would be contented with just taking the $15,000 they were owed.
Right.
Because, it's only $2,300 of it is property taxes, right? The rest is all this other stuff. But they were not. They took the entire condo, took absolute title to the property, sold it for $40,000 and kept all $40,000. Geraldine was left with nothing. And unfortunately, that was perfectly legal according to Minnesota's law. And Minnesota is not the only state with laws like this. At the time, there were more than a dozen states with laws like that. Now there's 10 states that regularly do it, plus these other loophole states, which we can talk about a bit later. But and then Washington, D.C., of course. So the number shrunk, fortunately, and I anticipate it'll shrink a lot in the next year. But what happened was, she was left with nothing. She filed a lawsuit alleging a violation of her constitutional rights to just compensation. And, the Fifth Amendment to the US Constitution says when the government takes private property for public use, it must pay just compensation. And that, of course, applies through the 14th Amendment, which makes the states liable to protect certain rights.
Right.
And then the Eighth Amendment says that the government cannot impose excessive fines. And so she alleged a violation of both of those rights. And she lost in the trial court. Pacific Legal Foundation was then able to step in on appeal. And we lost in the Eighth Circuit, unanimously lost, by the way.
Yeah. I don't know much about the Eighth Circuit. I'm usually talking about the Ninth Circuit where crazy stuff tends to happen, but that boggles my mind.
It boggled my mind as well, because I think it's not just fairly obvious on the law, like it's intuitive that the government shouldn't be allowed to take more than what's owed.
Right.
And anyway, yeah, And we're not asking for a special rule. We're literally asking for the exact same rule that applies in every other debt collection circumstance and that the government normally follows if it's collecting, for instance, um, income taxes that are delinquent or personal property taxes that are delinquent. So you would think that we would have won there. We did not. And so we petitioned the Supreme Court to take Ms. Tyler's case. And coincidentally, at the same time, we just the day before, we were filing another case out of Nebraska. So we had these two cases, and they had the exact same legal issues, just different set of facts. Those facts
Yeah.
were out of Nebraska. And on January 13th, the Supreme Court agreed to hear Miss Tyler's case. And then in May, they ruled for Miss Tyler and unanimously said it was a taking of private property without just compensation. And in other words, the government was unconstitutionally taking more than what was owed. The court said that a taxpayer must render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but no more.
Right.
And I think that sums it up pretty nicely.
Yeah. And I think, there are so many levels of shock in this one, right? So first of all, this exists
Yeah.
and existed for a very long time.
Yep.
So thousands and thousands of people have been harmed by this over the decades. And then even at the very first blush of a legal challenge, the entire legal machine says, nope, this is A-okay.
Yep.
Until you get to the highest of the legal machine. And it blows me away that you can have, I mean, what kind of a rebuke is that for a lower court to unanimously decide something and then have it overturned unanimously by the higher court? I mean,
I think it's pretty great. And
it's fantastic. But I
they
mean,
can't blame the briefing because I briefed it in the Eighth Circuit and I gave the same historical based argument and the argument that this is the same exact type of debt collection that you see in other circumstances. So it was a pretty great vindication for
yeah,
Ms. Keller's constitutional rights, and not just her rights though. A lot of states are still doing this, and fortunately, after we won in May, um, we have seen some exciting things happening on the legislative front. So Maine already fixed their statute to allow property owners to go claim the surplus proceeds. Now, the claim period is a lot shorter than what I would like. I think it was 90 days or something like
of
that.
course.
But still, it's better than nothing, which is what they were doing before. And so that's exciting. And then I think I heard that New York was going to just freeze tax foreclosures for now until they have a chance to look at the statutes again. And Nebraska ended what we call home equity theft. Of course, Nebraska is an interesting state. I mentioned we filed another petition within a day of filing the Tyler petition. We actually filed two, one the day before and one a few weeks later, and both out of Nebraska. The Nebraska Supreme Court said that the same type of practice in Nebraska is A-okay, doesn't violate the state or federal constitution. And after we won the Tyler case, the Supreme Court granted those petitions, vacated the lower court's decisions, didn't write an opinion, but just sent it back with instructions to consider in light of the court's decision in Tyler. So that was a really exciting signal that, very, very good news for our clients there. And what happened also in June, I think it was in June, the Nebraska legislature passed this law ending home equity theft. They now will sell the properties through a judicial process and pay the debts and then return the remainder to the former owner. So that's exciting.
Yeah.
So there's a lot happening, and I think we're going to see a lot more of those kinds of laws in the next year, so that states will be complying with the constitutional requirements that the Supreme Court laid out in Miss Tyler's case.
Yeah. Yeah. And it begs other questions, right? Like when a lower court, let's randomly pick, when the Eighth Circuit, for instance, perhaps makes a bad call, or what is later found to be a bad call, if they worked in the real world, they'd be forced to go take a remedial class on constitutional law, right? I mean, to catch up or remind themselves of what these things are. But I realize there's sort of a face saving element to law of, oh, okay, well, we just now have new set precedent. So that's what will guide us moving forward, is this new set precedents. Whereas, if anyone had just simply read or followed along with you when you read the Constitution to them, they would have gotten that this law is so clearly not in line with what our rights are supposed to be. It just blows me away. It blows me away, particularly since you've got such a dramatic, complete shift, a 180-degree turn from everybody says, nope, this is okay, to nope, it's not okay, and it's a unanimous decision, which isn't a common thing when the Supreme Court comes out with a decision on something. Do you have any thoughts on the other part of this, which is, how did we get to a $13,000 additional fees thing? I mean, that seems to almost fall again into the unreasonable fees line that you mentioned earlier. And I get that's a separate argument to make. You wouldn't want to cloud the issue you were fighting.
Right.
Boy, does that seem like a bloated number to me.
Well, it seems bloated to me too, and maybe attorneys will be able to look at that kind of issue now that we've removed the more concerning obstacle. I
Right.
mean, we weren't even able to win before on that surplus that they were taking
Yeah,
beyond.
you got to prioritize. I get it, but man.
But now, I mean, certainly I think that private counsel out there should be looking at the costs that are being tacked on, because it seems unbelievable that you could turn a $2,300 debt into $15,000.
Yeah.
Uh, so, that's certainly something that should be looked at.
How far in arrears was she? Was it 2 years, 3 years?
I think it was like 4 years and some
Yeah,
months
that
by the
boggles
time
my
I
mind.
took it. It something like 4 years and a few months.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, given the unanimous decision of the Eighth Circuit, what was the amazing argument that the opposition provided as to why this was okay? What was their most convincing argument?
I didn't think any of their arguments were convincing, but the most amusing one was that they cited to. So we cited, for instance, Magna Carta, the Great Charter of Rights from
Sure.
1215, that said that the king could only take as much was owed. If somebody died owing money to the king, then the king could only take property worth about that much money. He wasn't able to just simply take everything.
Right.
And so we cited the Great Charter of Rights, the Magna Carta, and they cited feudalism. So they cited,
Sweet.
yeah, they cited to this feudal practice where lords could evict tenants if they didn't have property sufficient to pay a debt. They could then evict the tenant from what all is understood as essentially belonging to the crown,
Yeah.
and then just evict them if they failed to pay their services or their debts
Yeah.
to the Lord. Of course, that wasn't how they collected taxes. That was how they collected what was known as quit rent, or services to. So quit rent replaced the services. I don't want to get too nerdy on you, but
No, no, no. Nerdy's fine. I was a history major. So what's interesting is you can make an argument for the historical significance of the Magna Carta to the United States as a guiding document that came right off the boat when everybody first got off. Nobody can make the claim that there's anything about feudal law that in any way, at any time, was ever emulated, suggested, or even discussed seriously by anyone who, in fact, we were fleeing, aside from religious stuff, that.
that's exactly right. There's this great article from Thomas Jefferson where he specifically notes how terrible feudalism is and the fact
Yeah.
that the colonies unanimously rejected it.
Yeah. I
And
just
this was,
happen to have that book right on my bookshelf right there.
yeah.
Yep. Yep.
And so that he just blasted it before actually the Declaration of Independence. And then once our nation was founded, all the colonies, all the new states, I should say, unanimously rejected feudalism.
Yeah. It's amazing to me. That kind of stuff boggles my mind. Okay. And what was the other thing? I know you and I chatted previously about this a little bit, and one of the other arguments they made was, well, this is just the way we've always done it.
Right.
Was that one of
Yeah.
the other, which is just classic? I mean, that one, I think a lawyer who is speaking in front of a high court, that takes some major stones to think that the status quo is the reason why we should do it.
Yeah, it's been going on for 100 years,
Yeah.
almost, not quite actually, but almost a long time. And so
Yeah.
therefore it becomes constitutional by virtue of the passage of time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, fortunately, our constitutional rights don't just disappear because nobody enforced them earlier.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that most people who lose their property this way are too poor to hire lawyers. And so PLF we don't charge our clients anything. We're a nonprofit. So fortunately, we were able to take that kind of case on. But for a long time, people that this would happen to, they would just weren't noticed. And if they were able to get legal counsel, this is a whole other area of the law. The lawyer maybe didn't want to try to have to go out and forge new law. And so there were not very many cases addressing whether it was a taking. Um, there was a case here, a case there, state Supreme Court decision here and there, that sort of thing, or trial level stuff. And it went both ways. Some courts ruled that it was a taking, others said it wasn't a taking. And so the exciting thing is now the US Supreme Court has finally weighed in, and hopefully all the lower courts will
Yeah.
harmonize now.
Yeah. And I don't see a lot of ambiguity in understanding what the word taking means. And I realize there's some legal subtleties there that need to be ironed out. But when when something is the property of someone else and someone else removes it for their own control, that's kind of taking. So I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I agree. The Eighth Circuit said that essentially, oh, well, there might have been a property right at one point, but the state legislature abrogated the right. And so this was okay. Of course, if you use that logic, then the takings clause would basically just be whatever your state legislature says it is, which
yeah,
would just carve a massive hole in it. Um, Fortunately, the US Supreme Court uh, specifically noted that. They say, yes, state law can be one important source of property rights, but it's not the exclusive source. Otherwise, they could totally erase the takings clause and define it to mean whatever they want.
yeah.
But
And the bottom line is we wouldn't need a Supreme Court if that were true.
yeah, yeah,
Right. I mean, the decision itself abrogates itself by simply acknowledging a Supreme Court exists. You acknowledge there's a higher level of rightness than what you decide is
right.
right.
So because of the 14th Amendment, the states have to agree to abide by these federal constitutional protections for
Right.
individual rights. And so, the states subjected themselves to that when the 14th Amendment was added.
Yeah. Now, in terms of, and of course, this is the tip of the iceberg for PLF. You guys have been doing amazing stuff for years. I mean, I started my podcast back in 2007, and I've been following you guys enthusiastically for a very long time. And in fact, encouraging my oldest son, who says he's going to go to law school, to go work for you guys if he ever gets the chance. But there's a long list of things you guys have fought in California, the Coastal Commission, and nationally, the EPA. What are some other key issues that you think are coming to the forefront today that are going to be facing property rights? The battles you guys see over the horizon for PLF and the folks you fight for?
Yeah. So, one of the things, I mean, that I'm personally interested in, I'm really interested in the excessive fines clause, which has really been underused. Wasn't even officially incorporated against the states. In other words, the Supreme Court didn't say, yeah, that's also a fundamental right. That the 14th Amendment protects people against this sort of abuse of power by state governments.
Yeah.
So the excessive fines clause, one, there's so many fines launched at people. We all know it applies in the criminal context, but there's a lot of jurisdictions where the courts don't want to apply it in the civil context, or
Mhm.
if they do so, it's very limited. We'll say that.
Yeah.
Uh, Another issue is that you have, rather than just outright taking property, the government will regulate away the use of the property, or they'll create all sorts of weird rules involving, for instance, rentals. If you decide to rent your property out and you want to move back into it, do you have to pay the tenant in order to get your property back? Some states, they make it so that you can't get your property back without, massive payments to people, um, or that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of interesting um, rules like that out there that really just encroach upon private property rights and rights that I think were intended to be protected by the Constitution. So those are big issues. We have a petition pending in the Supreme Court actually, where the property owner was just trying to get part of the duplex back for family to live in,
Yeah.
and um, so it's an interesting issue.
And you've hit on one that obviously impacts me quite a bit, being in the real estate world, and that always shocks me. If you have a signed contract that's completely legal in every single way that says, depending on your state, right, whether 30 days is required, 60 days, 90 days, whatever it is, if you've given the adequate notice, how does any government agency think they need to step in and stop you from being able to enforce something that was agreed upon by all parties at the time? That's always kind of
Right.
boggled my mind.
Yeah, and one of the most fundamental rights in your property rights, your rights to your property, is the right to exclude.
Hmm.
And so I get it, if if you've agreed to rent out your property, there's certain state laws that are going to apply, right? But at some point, after your term has expired and you've given the notice and you want your property back, you want to live in it or your family wants to live in it, it's pretty shocking that the government could come in and stop you from being able to get it back.
Yeah. What do
Yeah.
you think about this is another one that's a big one because there are a lot of localities that are starting to do this. Um, Changing the laws so that homeowners cannot do short-term rentals, for instance. Let's say they've been doing long-term rentals and they want to switch over to short-term rentals. And instead of saying, right, we are now going to on the spot enforce whatever violations are happening from those short-term renters, we're going to simply say, you, the person in the house right now who is making too much noise at 10 p.m. or whatever, you're either going to jail or you're getting a ticket or whatever it is you're going to get. Instead of doing that, they lean into, you, the owner of this place, is no longer allowed to rent it in this way anymore.
Yeah, I think that's really unfortunate. I haven't given a lot of thought on the constitutional theories that would
Yeah.
apply, if there are any that would work in that context. But it's troubling. It's certainly troubling because if people are noisy, if they're obnoxious, obviously, like you said, there's other rules that you can enforce, and those are the ones that should be enforced.
Yeah.
Um, and you can fine those people for being loud,
Yeah.
uh, and causing a nuisance to the neighborhood, that sort of thing. But yeah, it's troubling. I certainly don't think it's fair, and it makes it harder for regular people to compete. A lot of bans on short-term rentals are, there's other motives involved, and sometimes it's like the hotel industry lobbying for those kinds of rules.
Yeah, I didn't want to be the first one to say it. I have a place on Oahu that I rent as a short-term rental, or tried to for a while. And within the
Yeah.
last couple of years, the island of Oahu, which is the whole county of Honolulu, has basically outlawed it unless you get very special numbers and you're in very special zones. And the purported version is it's to preserve neighborhoods. The real reason is that the hotel lobby is huge in Hawaii, and they didn't like that they weren't seeing as many butts in beds as they used to. So that kind of stuff is a little bit grating. But now it's California's looking at doing it in different areas. It's a growing thing, and every once in a while you'll see headlines relating specifically to Airbnb or VRBO or any of these places where you do short-term rentals. That these different municipalities are looking at imposing more restrictions on property rights relating to that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, are you aware of any key California issues? I know we're talking really, my audience is pretty national, but I've got a good local California homegrown kind of vibe going on with some folks. Do you see any big issues coming up in California, either things that are new that are annoying or things that have been around forever that you guys have your eye on?
Oh goodness, PLF has all kinds of California cases.
Yeah.
But perhaps because I didn't eat lunch, none of them are popping into my head. You mentioned the Sackett case earlier, though. We could talk about that. That was
Yeah, I'd love to. I mean, I know there was a few, obviously this is more ancient history, but I know way back, there was about 8 years ago, one where you guys were fighting the good fight with the California Coastal Commission, and that one seemed to dovetail nicely with the Sackett decision, because it was one of those, somebody had a puddle in their backyard and suddenly you're under the jurisdiction of the Coastal Commission in California, and this is just sort of the national version of that, right? The EPA thing.
so yeah, so PLF has had a ton of cases against the Coastal Commission, including a pretty famous property rights case against the Coastal Commission that made it all the way up to the US Supreme Court, that said basically the government can't use the permitting process to um, basically force people to give away their private property to the
Yeah.
government. That was an easement that the government was taking that had nothing to do with, it wasn't justified by what the permit that the property owners were seeking. I
Yeah.
guess you could put it that way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, but there's a lot of cases against the California Coastal Commission. But I'm really excited about PLF's win against the EPA in the Sackett case. That case has been dragging on, oh goodness, something like 15 years.
Oh, I had no idea.
Yeah, and uh, PLF represents the Sacketts, who essentially they were just trying to build their home, their dream home, a few blocks from Priest Lake, and it was in a residentially zoned neighborhood. There were lots of land. There's houses on one side, and there are streets on both sides of the property, and it's like a couple
Okay.
blocks from the lake. And they get all the permits that they need, or that they thought they reasonably would need, and did their due diligence. Paid money, to look into, to make sure that they were following the rules. And they started building. They put fill material down, and then basically government agents pulled up and said that they were violating the Clean Water Act, and they were going to be fined massive amounts of money, and you need to stop what you're doing. You don't have a Clean Water Act permit.
Was
So
this the one where they were going to charge these folks some ridiculous, like $10,000 a day or some
more.
crazy thing? Oh my
Yeah,
gosh.
it was actually more.
Okay.
And yeah, and so, but it would be insane amounts of money now after all those years, right?
Sure.
So PLF representative filed a suit and saying that this is not within the Clean Water Act jurisdiction. This is not a navigable water of the United States. It is not within the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. And so PLF went to the Supreme Court twice on that. The first time it was on, can you even get your day in court? Because the government responded by saying, well, all we sent is a compliance order threatening that you will be fined. We
Right.
haven't fined you yet. We're just threatening you. And
I
so
did a show on that when you guys got that decision made. That's why it's ringing a bell. Okay. Gotcha.
yeah, so all the way back in 2012,
Yeah.
PLF won in the US Supreme Court the right for the Sacketts to argue that this is not within the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act. Now, here we are in 2023, 11 years
Swift
later.
justice, baby.
And finally, the Sacketts just won a unanimous rebuke by the Supreme Court to the EPA, saying that the Clean Water Act does not apply to their property. And now there was a split of opinion about how much they should go into about what the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act is, but they all agreed that it didn't apply to the Sacketts. So
Yeah.
that was really an exciting opinion, because for a long time people have been subject to the Clean Water Act, when it's totally unclear whether that, that little puddle in their yard qualifies as navigable water of the United States within the meaning of the Clean Water Act or not.
Yeah.
And fortunately, this clarifies a lot, and so it makes it a lot more feasible for people who need permits to know if they need to go to the United States for a Clean Water Act permit now. It's very exciting. It limits the scope of the act to something that I would call much more reasonable.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and what's funny is I seem to recall at the time that, a lot of people have been screaming about abolish the EPA or whatever for whatever reasons. The first time I ever heard it get traction, though, with pretty level-headed folks was after this. Not this, but 2012 this,
Yeah.
when these things were first coming out and the details of what the EPA thought they had the authority to do, and talking about an abuse of authority. It was really shocking, and you had some mainstream voices saying, yeah, maybe we need to think about starting over with some of
Yeah,
this.
it's been outrageous too, the way that it's been enforced. PLF had a client die in prison because he built some ponds on his land to address fires. He lived out in the middle of nowhere, Montana, and he built these ponds that actually didn't damage the environment at all. It's just he didn't get the Clean Water Act permit that the federal government came in and said he should have gone and sought before doing so. So,
But if he
um,
had bought 5,000 gallon tanks, he would have been fine,
I
right?
guess. Yeah, I guess so. But what he did, it was actually good for the environment, what he was doing. It's obviously better if, his land isn't burnt to a crisp. And
Yeah.
he wasn't harming the environment, that's for sure. And we had other clients like where the federal government has come after them and just over outrageous things. Like I remember there was one case several years ago. Where the property owner was like clearing out debris from a ditch and received this scary letter. And I've heard anecdotally similar stories from other people, but so there's been a lot of really abusive activity from the federal government. They just sort of use the Clean Water Act to scare a lot of well-meaning people who have done nothing wrong. And now this is going to limit their power to bully people. So it's pretty exciting.
Yeah, no, that's great news all the way around. And you have to wonder how these agencies even find out a guy is emptying crud from his ditch. I mean, what satellite am I paying for that's watching the ditch cleaners?
Yeah, and
Um,
there's like literally apparently litter in it. The property owner was cleaning out litter, but also some tree branches and things so that it would drain properly. It was like a dry arroyo in the desert.
yeah,
And they came and said this was like a Clean Water Act violation.
that's crazy.
Yeah. And my favorite one though was PLF represented a property owner who built these stock ponds on his land that actually had been demonstrated to improve the environment and improve water quality, and yet the EPA still came after him until PLF got involved.
So, maybe I've just become old and jaded, but I'm very much a follow the money guy. If you, and also any power that could then make you money later, right? And I find that when I do that and I look at it from that perspective, I find some very interesting connections. Maybe it's wandering into tinfoil hat territory. I don't know. But how much of that do you see in this, where clearly there is a off talking point reason why this thing is happening, was happening, does happen, and
Um,
it could, I mean, just your thoughts. I'd love to hear.
I mean, I haven't seen that. I mean, and my personal involvement in those cases has been pretty limited. But what I've seen more of, I think, is there's just a little bit of what you might call an anti-human bias in some agencies where I view people as actually a beneficial part of the environment. We are part of nature. And I think there's a bias in some agencies, at least among some of the employees, that we are almost like an inherent evil.
I think
And
I heard one interview where someone from the EPA accidentally referred to humans as a blight.
yeesh.
Yeah. So that's actually an interesting point. So from your perspective, from your experience, and I'm not going to like suggest you start naming names or anything like that, but the vibe you get is that what you find typically is less like evil and more folks who have a definite opinion on what is good or is not good for the environment, and in general human interaction with the environment is bad, so they like to use their authority to minimize that as much as possible.
That's what I perceive. I mean, like I said, I'm really more in the straight property rights world without
Sure.
the environmental angle. My involvement in those cases has been significantly less.
Okay.
Uh, but emotion here and that sort of thing. But yeah,
That's a
that's
tough thing to fight when it's institutionalized, right? When someone's feelings can have a very dramatic effect on how policy gets implemented or penalties get levied. I mean, that's a big deal, right? I mean, that's
well, and there's also just the general thing that, power will be exercised.
yeah,
So if you have the power, you're going to exercise it in some fashion, and that's
yeah,
bound to sometimes turn out in an abusive manner. And
yeah.
so if these agencies are convinced they've got the power, then you're going to have some of these outrageous cases,
You've
unfortunately.
got to
So,
use it to exercise it, I guess, right? You've got it to keep it
yeah.
lower.
I
You've got
think
to
some of
use it.
my views, though, on sort of that mindset might be shaped by, where I've lived a significant portion of my life in the Pacific Northwest and just interacted with people who seem to view humans as sort of a blight. Um,
Yeah. All right.
Whereas I don't. I believe humans should be and can be, and often are, a beneficial part of nature that we can improve and protect nature.
Yeah. No, yeah,
There,
this stewardship is, I think, a key role that humans play in the process if it's being done right, you know.
yeah,
Uh, and I don't think people, and obviously this is a completely different conversation, but a lot of people don't realize that part of the natural process is in some cases destruction, right? You if you never let a forest fire happen, you're not helping nature. You know, some trees can only reproduce through fire, right? Their acorns only crack open and under fire, and in order to refertilize the soil, fire needs to happen in some areas. And when you get too much undergrowth, you get overburn, right? So the negative things are also a positive thing in the natural world, and a lot of people seem to have a little bit too much of a, I don't know, maybe a Disney movie perception of how everything is supposed to be. But
well, wait a minute. Disney movies usually have things like crazy forest fires.
sure, I guess that's right. If we're going to go straight to Bambi, which is one of the most, which if you really want to make children cry, that's the one you go to first, right? So, but so one other actual legal topic I wanted to hit with you while I've got you is so where economic development was equated with public use, and that I'm specifically kind of referring to Kilo versus New London, and the reason this is the one that I think is relatively famous. I'm sure most folks realize that this is the one where eminent domain gets used to take property from one person to give it to another person because the new person's going to do better with it. And it's this process of transferring is done by the government based on the idea that the government will make more money once the process is over. And it's one of the few things where I actually protested. So because someone tried to do it here in Morgan Hill, and it was just one thing too many. I couldn't, and it was also happening when the big real estate thing was going on in late 2007, 2008, when you were floating around a little bit looking for where you were going to land with the legal degree.
Trying to find a job. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. We could have used you down here to hold a sign on the corner of Dunn and Monterey here in Monterey to complain, or here in Morgan Hill to complain about that one. They wanted to seize a strip mall on a corner because somebody else would do something different with it and the taxes would go up. Luckily, that didn't happen because enough people got upset. But I'm wondering if any of these decisions that have happened recently, do you see any roads or paths towards repealing Kilo versus New London so that we're not as broadly defining what public use is to simply mean a financial benefit?
I mean, possibly. I mean, that it was a close decision. Kilo was close.
Yeah.
And I would say we've had a lot of good property rights decisions from the Supreme Court. So yeah, I mean, is it possible? Certainly. Yeah, it's just somebody has
Gotcha.
the right case. And something good that came out of Kelo was that there was an enormous amount of state level legislation and activity to protect people from having their properties seized for exactly the reason that you said, because, oh, if we take it from A and give it to B,
Yeah.
that B, they're going to build this big thing and the tax assessment will go up.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and there were a lot of states that passed laws that specifically outlawed that. Almost every state did something to varying degrees of success. So I think that limits, the most extreme. I guess you could say it limits the number of those kinds of abuses that you're going to see, which is a good thing.
Yeah. No, I
Be-
agree. I'd much rather see things fixed at the as local level as possible
Right. So you're not
first.
seeing as many of these kinds of outrageous abuses. And so there's perhaps fewer opportunities to get a case like that to the Supreme Court so that they can reverse themselves, or have an opportunity to decide if they want to
Yeah.
reverse themselves. So, I mean, it's certainly possible with this Supreme Court that seems to have a pretty solid originalist view on property rights, at least to some degree,
Yeah.
um, property rights are not just what the government says, that sort of thing. That's encouraging.
Yeah. And I think one thing to bring up here for everyone who's listening is, you mentioned earlier folks who don't have the resources to get their own legal representation. As Christina has mentioned, PLF is a nonprofit organization. So for folks who find themselves being beat over the head with some sort of incursion onto their property rights, you can go to pacificlegal.org, look into who these folks are, and get in contact with them and see if they can help you with their case. So there's a knot at the end of your rope that you can hold on to, and it's got a big PLF sign hanging off of it. So feel free to reach out to those folks. Um,
And we
if
have a tab on there that is under that's on the homepage. That's at the
Mhm.
kind of bottom of the list of things that says submit a case, and you can fill out that form
Mhm.
with details about your case and your information.
That's great. All right, now have I missed anything? Is there anything you just have a burning desire to share with the 4 or 5 people who may be listening to my show this week?
Well, so we do have a lot of legislative activity going on. If you want to know if your state is involved in home equity theft, you should go to homeequitytheft.org. And I'm pulling it up now. There's this beautiful map on the homepage that shows states in red, yellow, and green. And the good states are in green, the red state, and that doesn't mean that the tax foreclosure process is perfect, but it at least means that the statutes don't appear to give the government the authority to just take a windfall when they're collecting property taxes.
Yeah,
The red states outright authorize the taking of a windfall in pretty much any regular tax foreclosure situation. The yellow states um, have some loopholes. So they usually protect homes, but maybe they don't protect other types of businesses, or they
yeah,
protect property usually. But then if a land bank wants the property for a public reason, or if certain affordable housing nonprofits want the property, for instance, in California, then you know, then they've got this loophole in California. And then there's a few states on there that we have on there. We don't actually know if they're engaging in any home equity theft. Texas and Wisconsin are the two that come to mind. We don't know if they're actually doing any, but there's some bad language on the books that should just be
I
tightened
see
up.
what you're saying. So
So
almost preemptively evaluating what the laws are currently to see if there's a window of abuse that could be exercised by somebody in there.
exactly. Yeah. And there's legislation pending in a lot of these red states, actually. The ones that, the versus the green states.
Right,
I'm
right,
not
right.
talking red and blue states. We're
Right.
talking red, yellow, and green. Um, So there's a lot of legislation pending. And like Massachusetts has a bill that had a hearing recently. And so that it's all very exciting. But if you want to know if your state is on the naughty list so that you maybe there's a way you want to get involved,
Yeah.
want to write a story about it, if, that sort of thing, you can go to homeequitytheft.org and find out there what the rule is in your state.
Yeah, that's great. And then, anytime we can make things easier for folks to discover what might most impact them, I think we're helping a lot of people. Um, yeah. So, and we're in one of those situations where as soon as I think you guys have done something amazing in just a year or two, some other crazy case comes up where I thought nothing could be crazier than this one, right? And today I think this Tyler Hennepin thing seemed so obvious on its face. That's got to be one of the few things that's still on the books, right? That there can't be more. You guys always end up digging up something else that's
Yeah, we'll probably find
ridiculous.
something else. Just when you think you've heard it all, you hear some other terrible government abuse.
Yeah,
And so we are not, we're hoping to put ourselves out of work on the home equity theft side of the coin, but
yeah,
there's an endless amount of work in fighting government abuse, and just protecting essentially the little guy from
yeah.
the big
Well,
bad state.
you guys need to keep an eye on California because just in January, we went from having a $92 billion surplus to having a $32 billion shortfall. And if there's one thing Texas is famous for is getting into some creepy, weird stuff when they need to make more money. So I'm sure some other interesting, obscure California law will either surface or get created. There's two and they're looking at now. One is a exit tax for Californians who want to move out of the state, or at least businesses. There's some money limits put on it. The other one is a mileage tax where they want to charge 4 cents per gallon, which would be about $80 a tank, or 80 cents per gallon more for gas in California, where we're already over 50% of our gas costs are taxes.
That's
So,
shocking because it's actually that's as regressive as a tax as you can get, because
yeah.
wealthy people will just go buy an electric car, they'll buy a Tesla. And
Oh, I don't think it matters what runs your car. It's you report the mileage of your vehicle when you renew the
wait, what?
registration.
I
Yeah.
assume you meant like on the gas.
No. Nope. This is something you'd pay when you register your car, and you'd report how many miles your car has gone, and then you pay 4 cents a mile. Did I say a gallon? I meant to say 4 cents a mile for every
Good
mile you drive your car.
grief. That I
Yeah,
mean that I mean, but that's still pretty regressive
absolutely.
because who has to spend the most time commuting? It's often people who can't afford to live in, you know, the
And
middle
in
of.
my area, the people who can work remotely tend to be the higher paid folks, right? And so they don't need to drive. Your coders, all kinds of different creatives don't need to necessarily go in, but the folks who need to sweep the floors and mop the floors and cook the food and do all the things that society depends on, those poor folks are going to be paying 4 cents a mile
Goodness. Well,
to
I hope that
drive to work.
have they passed it?
No, no, no. I'm no lawyer, but it seems to me that the moving out of the state tax won't fly for interstate commerce reasons. I would imagine it would get challenged. You can give me an opinion on whether you think that's
I hope
true.
so. I mean, I haven't looked at that personally, but that came to my mind too.
Yeah. The problem is the US government does it if you leave the country. So I don't know if the state might try to make the same argument. But
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a pretty bold move. We're gonna get you if you try to leave.
yeah. Yeah, you're all and here's the thing, right? So the most recent numbers we have, and this is all based on IRS data, and I realize we've completely gone into the weeds, but my people are used to that, so don't panic. Um, as of the numbers we have for 2021 from the IRS, and obviously they know people have moved because their mailing addresses change, right? Something like 67% of the people who left California in 2021 made over $200,000 a year. And since 2018 or 19, I think it's 2019, California's lost 500,000 people net, right?
Wow.
So
Yeah.
figure out how much that is in taxes.
A lot of money.
Yeah. And we've lost Oracle. Oracle was considered one of the kind of founding members of the Silicon Valley, tech circle around here. We've lost tons and tons of companies to, Florida and Texas and Arizona and Nevada.
I thought they
Uh,
all moved to Austin.
you know what's funny? I worked for Apple in the beginning of the '90s for a little while, and I helped the search process to relocate Apple to a different state. We were looking at Austin, someplace in Colorado, and another place, I think, even further east. There were three different places, and then Cupertino and the state gave Apple a sweetheart deal to make them keep their headquarters in Cupertino, but they moved their entire technical support organization to Austin.
Oh,
So a huge chunk of folks. And I actually at the time got an offer to go move to Austin with that group, but I was, I was doing real estate at the same time I was doing that. So I decided to stay. But yeah, so it blows my mind that even Apple, there was a time, even before things got crazy, that Apple was considering leaving the state of California.
yeah.
And now today things are absolutely loony. So
You would think that at some point it might just occur to them, maybe we should punish people less for staying in California rather than trying to punish them for leaving.
yeah, it's one of those things where you keep punching yourself in the face and saying, well, maybe I just need to punch harder and faster, and then the pain will stop. Right? It just, and I realize we're getting wonky now, but if we wanted to bring up things like the Laffer curve, right, where at a certain point taxation drops when you raise taxes because people say, forget it, I'm out, I'm taking my ball home and I'm leaving.
Well, when you're in a hole, just keep digging.
Yeah, exactly right. You're bound to come out somewhere, right? I guess. But yeah, so then that's the thing. But we could have a whole other conversation about it. It just doesn't make sense that to solve a problem like this, they want to tax more instead of make it attractive for businesses and individuals to stay and happily pay the taxes that would be imposed versus all the other silliness.
Yeah.
But anyway. So you've been very generous with your time. We've been talking for just about an hour. I want to thank you for taking so much time out and giving us your insights here. Where can people find you? I know I follow you on Twitter, so I'm going to get all the updates. Where are the best places to find out what Christina and the team are up to?
Pacificlegal.org. We post case updates and things there. You can also follow PLF on Twitter. And I think we have links to our Twitter account on our homepage. I should
Yeah,
probably
Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube.
Yeah.
See on there. So, and the YouTube channel is amazing, by the way. So, if you want to see a video of the case she was talking about from 2012, that's why I know it, because I saw the video you guys posted about it way back then, where it
Yeah.
was this crazy thing where they were charging these people multiple tens of thousands of dollars a day for being in violation of a stupid thing. And as they panned around, you could see they had neighbors on all sides. So there were houses everywhere in this development. It was a neighborhood. It wasn't some pristine wildlife preserve with the big old waterway. You couldn't even see the water. The water was like lots away.
Yeah. And it
It's
wasn't even the water from that land that they say was hydrologically significant. Instead, you'd have to pool it together with water on the other side of the road in an actual nice
so
wetland
crazy.
that's on the over there.
Yeah.
They pool it together, but if you combine that water, then it becomes significant. And because it's the water that drains off the Sackett's property, and then it goes
Gosh.
through a ditch, and then it goes over to a creek, and then eventually it drains into the lake. And that was how they were claiming jurisdiction over the
So
property.
amazing.
Fortunately, all 9 justices agreed that that was,
Stupid. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it goes beyond the
I'm
authority of
I'm sure
Congress.
there's a much more flowery legal term for that's stupid, but that's what I'm going to go with because that's where my head's at right now. But
Beyond the authority of the Clean Water Act.
yeah. All right, Christina. Thanks again for spending so much time with us. I really appreciate it.
Sure thing. Thank you.
You bet.